and replaced the alcohol lamp so that the glow of light could be seen more clearly from the barren. Then he went to the hole and crawled through. Peter followed him. As if infuriated by their audacity, the storm lashed itself over the top of the dune. They could hear the hissing whine of fine hard snow tearing above their heads like volleys of shot, and the force of the wind reached them even in their shelter, bringing with it the flinty sting of the snow dust. Beyond them the black barren was filled with a dismal moaning. Looking up, and yet seeing nothing in the darkness, Peter understood where the weird shriekings and ghostly cries came from. It was the wind whipping itself up the side and over the top of the dune. Jolly Roger listened, hearing only the convulsive sweep of that mighty force over 1,000 miles of barren. And then came again one of those brief intervals when the storm seemed to rest for a moment, and its moaning grew less and less until it was like the sound of giant chariot wheels receding swiftly over the face of the earth. Then came the silence, a few seconds of it, while in the north gathered swiftly the whispering rumble of a still greater force. And in this silence came once more a cry which Jolly Roger McKay could no longer disbelieve, and close upon the cry the report of a rifle. Again he could have sworn the voice was a woman's voice. As nearly as he could judge, it came from dead ahead, out of the chaos of blackness, and in that direction he shouted an answer. Then he ran out into the darkness, followed by Peter. Another avalanche of wind gathered at their heels, driving them on like the crest of a flood. In the first force of it, Jolly Roger stumbled and fell to his knees, and in that moment he saw very faintly the glow of his light at the opening in the snow dune. A realization of his deadly peril, if he lost sight of the light, flashed upon him. Again and again he called into the night. After that, bowing his head in the fury of the storm, he plunged on deeper into darkness. A sudden wild thought seized upon his soul and thrilled him into forgetfulness of the light and the snow dune and his own safety. In the heart of this mad world he had heard a voice. He no longer doubted it. And the voice was a woman's voice. Could it be Nada? Was it possible she had followed him after his flight, determined to find him and share his fate? His heart pounded. Who else, of all the women in the world, could be following his trail across the barrens, 1,000 miles from civilization? He began to shout her name. "Nada! Nada! Nada!" And hidden in the gloom at his side, Peter barked. Storm and darkness swallowed them. The last faint gleam of the alcohol lamp died out. Jolly Roger did not look back. Blindly he stumbled ahead, counting his footsteps as he went, and shouting Nada's name. Twice he thought he heard a reply, and each time the will-o'-the-wisp voice seemed to be still farther ahead of him. Then, with a fiercer blast of the wind beating upon his back, he stumbled and fell forward upon his face. His hand reached out and touched the thing that had tripped him. It was not snow. His naked fingers clutched in something soft and furry. It was a man's coat. He could feel buttons, a belt, and the sudden thrill of a bearded face. He stood up. The wind was wailing off over the barren again, leaving an instant of stillness about him, and he shouted, "Nada! Nada! Nada!" An answer came so quickly that it startled him, not one voice, but two, three, and one of them the shrill agonized cry of a woman. They came toward him as he continued to shout, until a few feet away he could make out a gray blur moving through the gloom. He went to it, staggering under the weight of the man he had found in the snow. The blur was made up of two men dragging a sledge, and behind the sledge was a third figure, moaning in the darkness. "I found someone in the snow!" Jolly Roger shouted. "Here he is!" He dropped his burden, and the last of his words were twisted by a fresh blast of the storm. But the figure behind the sledge had heard, and Jolly Roger saw her indistinctly at his feet, shielding the man he had found with her arms and body, and crying out a name which he could not understand in that howling of the wind. But a thing like cold steel sank into his heart, and he knew it was not Nada he had found this night on the Barren. He placed the unconscious man on the sledge, believing he was dead. The girl was crying out something to him, unintelligible in the storm, and one of the men shouted in a thick, throaty voice which he could not understand. Jolly Roger felt the weight of him as he staggered in the wind, fighting to keep his feet, and he knew he was ready to drop down in the snow and die. "It's only a step," he shouted. "Can you make it?" His words reached the ears of the others. The girl swayed through the darkness and gripped his arm. The two men began to tug at the sledge, and Jolly Roger seized the rope between them, wondering why there were no dogs, and faced the driving of the storm. It seemed an interminable time before he saw the faint glow of the alcohol lamp. The last 50 feet was like struggling against an irresistible hail from machine guns. Then came the shelter of the dune. One at a time, McKay helped to drag them through the hole which he used for a door. For a space his vision was blurred, and he saw through the hazy film of storm blindness the gray faces and heavily coated forms of those he had rescued. The man he had found in the snow he placed on his blankets, and the girl fell down upon her knees beside him. It was then Jolly Roger began to see more clearly, and in that same instant came a shock as unexpected as the smash of dynamite under his feet. The girl had thrown back her parkee and was sobbing over the man on the blankets, and calling him father. She was not like Nada. Her hair was in thick, dark coils, and she was older. She was not pretty now. Her face was twisted by the brutal beating of the storm, and her eyes were nearly closed. But it was the man Jolly Roger stared at, while his heart choked inside him. He was grizzled and gray-bearded, with military mustaches and a bald head. He was not dead. His eyes were open, and his blue lips were struggling to speak to the girl, whose blindness kept her from seeing that he was alive. And the coat which he wore was the regulation service garment of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. Slowly McKay turned, wiping the film of snow sweat from his eyes, and stared at the other two. One of them had sunk down with his back to the snow wall. He was a much younger man, possibly not over 30, and his face was ghastly. The third lay where he had fallen from exhaustion after crawling through the hole. Both wore service coats, with holsters at their sides. The man against the snow wall was making an effort to rise. He sagged back, and grinned up apologetically at McKay. "Damn fine of you, old man," he mumbled between blistered lips. "I'm Porter, N Division, taking Superintendent Tavish to Fort Churchill. Tavish and his daughter. Made a hell of a mess of it, haven't I?" He struggled to his knees. "There's brandy in our kit. It might help, over there," and he nodded toward the girl and the gray-bearded man on the blankets. End of chapter 13. Recording by Roger Moline.